in accordance with the Judaic record, and as evidenced by the physical and the historical elements of that era. This is the real-world story of Israel, and the exodus of Moses, including how and where the water of the Red Sea parted. This is the Red Sea. It is an intensely hot, waterless, and unforgiving tract of desert, whose aptly called name has existed since ancient times. Noah departed his island home just before it disappeared under the waves in a cataclysmic event, more popularly known today as the Great World Flood. For 150 days he and his sons drifted along on the ocean currents before their ship made landfall at a towering pinnacle of stone known as Ararat, located in the land of Shinar. And in time these few mariners eventually moved inland along the nearby riverway. But because the sons of Noah began to argue amongst themselves, Noah, who is the world's most well-known mariner and astronomer, divided the earth into 3 parts. And he did so by measuring from a very particular and most unique celestial line, as defined by the major standstill positions of the moon. Using the moon, which is Earth's only satellite of navigational importance, and by employing the ancient navigational techniques based upon equal altitude circles of position and lunar distances, a skilled mariner, such as Noah, can easily locate any place on the Earth's surface with great accuracy, which is the reason how and why the Judaic community ultimately came to use the ever-changing cycles of the moon as the primary means by which they determined both time and longitude. Noah then gave each of his 3 sons the instruction to go and to live only within the boundaries that he had assigned to them. Japheth received certain lands situated in the northern section, which were largely cold, while Ham received certain lands in the southern section, which were largely hot. But Shem, on the other hand, received land located in the most desired section of all, since this land was more temperate in nature. But just as importantly, it also lay directly beneath the mariners' primary navigational baseline, which had been devised long before their own time by Enoch, their maritime ancestor, a world traveler, and a man of genius. And for this reason, with the recent loss of their island home, the land allotted to Shem also inherently contained a most important single geodetic point, where the people descended from Shem would one day be responsible for erecting a monument in remembrance of their maritime heritage. A structure that would serve as a lasting memorial to those who had been lost beneath the waves of their former island home, simply because men had argued amongst themselves. And they would one day, far into the future, name this special point by a single term whose meaning is to mark something conspicuously. This was Zion. But for now, the new maritime nations had agreed to separate, with each of the brothers making the promise to remain only in the lands their father Noah had assigned to them. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, whose tribes established the new maritime nations in the various lands. And the sons of Ham were Put, Cush, Canaan, and Egypt. And Egypt was the father of Caslusum, from whom the Philistines came. But Canaan, after discovering the land promised to Shem to be more desirable than his own, ignored his brother's warnings not to do so, and he moved his entire tribe northward. And soon others followed, and they too created additional settlements and colonies in the broader outlying areas which ancient historians would later refer to as the regions of Syria and Philistia. As the respective populations in both the north and the south increased, various named districts, named territories, and named colonies began to emerge. Among the more prominent in the south was the Cushite colony of Midian, and the district of Goshen situated in the land of Egypt, while the people of Cash, native to their own country, continued to maintain their sovereign rights within their own territory. And among the districts, territories, and regional names that emerged in the north, in and about the land of Canaan, were Hebron, Beersheba, and the Philistine colony of Gerar, In addition, certain geographic terms were used to describe the unusual characteristics of both the natural features and the uncommon phenomena that presented themselves in and about these same areas. Among them was the term Euphrates, used to identify a most unique crossing point where two distinct land masses and two great salt seas came together. While the wide and expansive floodplain, which completely disappeared under an intense deluge of floodwater at the same time every year, was called Gihon, a term which meant the pathway of the rushing water, whose transliterated name would become more popularly pronounced as the Jordan, but is now called the Nile by modern mapmakers. As the sons of Shem also began to arrive from the sea, they too moved inland along the riverways to establish the settlements of Padan Aram and the township of Haran, in the district of Ur, where their skilled mariners and navigators continued to study the intricate movements of all phenomena pertaining to the celestial sphere, and with such a keen intensity that the discoveries they made and the formulas they devised are still in use to this day. In time, Abraham the Shemite, a highly skilled astronomer and mathematician in his own right, set out from the district of Ur, along with his nephew Lot, and went in search of the precise geodetic point where the memorial monument depicting their maritime heritage and loss would one day be erected by the descendants of Shem. But upon their arrival they found the populous Canaanites living in the land promised to Shem. Even though Canaan had been forewarned of the ramifications this disobedient act would cause. So Abraham and Lot, finding themselves at a disadvantage, had no choice but to resign themselves to this situation, and so they melded into the Canaanite population, where they began to engage in various business enterprises. As Abraham traveled in the land of Canaan, his Egyptian mistress gave birth to a son, whom they named Ishmael. But soon after Ishmael had been born, Sarai, Abraham's half-sister and legitimate wife, also gave birth to a son, and his name was Isaac. Sarai then demanded that Abraham rid himself of both his Egyptian mistress and his illegitimate, yet his firstborn son Ishmael, in order to prevent Ishmael from ever claiming his birthright, which was to inherit all of Abraham's ever-accumulating wealth. So Abraham, heeding Sarai's demand, took his mistress and their young son out into the desert wilderness of Paran, where he abandoned them, with the expectation that they would soon perish in that hostile environment. However, even though both Hagar and Ishmael managed to survive their near-death ordeal, the callous and ruthless actions of Abraham would never be forgotten by the descendants of Ishmael. And it would be these same remembrances that would one day have serious consequences for the descendants of Ishmael's half-brother, Isaac. After abandoning Hagar and Ishmael in the desert of Paran, Abraham returned to the land of Canaan, where he soon began making preparations to kill his only other son, intending to kill Isaac upon the very spot, the precise geodetic point, which he and Lot had originally set out to find. But Providence intervened, and Isaac survived Abraham's attempt to kill him. And so both father and son eventually went and settled in the district of Hebron, while Lot went and lived in the separate nearby place. But when Lot's home came under siege, he fled into the mountainous regions where he sired two sons, one by each of his two daughters. And the two sons produced by these incestuous relationships would eventually cross over to the other side of the Jordan and establish their own domains in the regions that would become known by their own names, Moab and Ammon. When Abraham died, Isaac did indeed inherit all of his father's wealth, with none being left to his half-brother Ishmael. Soon after Isaac had inherited all of Abraham's fortune, Isaac's cousin and wife Rebekah gave birth to twin boys. The first to be born was named Esau, and the second was named Jacob. But when Isaac was nearing the end of his own life, Jacob conspired with his mother Rebekah, and together they deceived Isaac, who was now aged and visually impaired, into believing he was passing his fortune on to Esau, but instead Because he had been deceived, Isaac swore an irrevocable oath and gave his fortune away not to Esau, the firstborn son, but instead he left it all to Jacob. When Esau discovered how he had been swindled out of his rightful inheritance, he became infuriated, and Jacob, fearing for his life, fled to live with his mother's family in the district of Ur. After Jacob's abrupt departure, Esau, whose nickname was Edom, having been swindled out of his rightful inheritance, also departed from the land of Canaan. And along with his Canaanite wives and his extended family members, he went on to establish his own domain in the land situated across the river from Paran, that would become known as the land of Edom. However, the injustice of Jacob's deception and the mistrust it had caused would never be forgotten by the people of Edom, and it would be this remembrance that would one day have dire consequences for the bloodline of all of Jacob's descendants. So Jacob remained in hiding for many years until a dispute with his uncle over his level of compensation caused him to secretly flee from the district of Ur, taking with him his entire family as well as a portion of his uncle's wealth. But as Jacob was journeying back to the land of Canaan from the scholarly district of Ur, he encountered a being of unusual intelligence who posed various questions that Jacob wrestled with throughout the night. In the morning, however, at the conclusion of their spirited debate, and because Jacob had impressed his interrogator with his understanding of various topics, among which were the powers attributed to the prevailing gods Isis, Ra, and Elohim, the philosopher paid tribute to Jacob's intellectual prowess by bestowing upon him the acronym named of Israel, and it would be the name Jacob would thereafter prefer and would thereafter be known by. So Israel returned to the land of Canaan with his large family, which now consisted of 12 sons, 6 by his wife Leah, 2 sons by his sister-in-law Rachel, while also siring 2 sons with Leah's maid and 2 sons by Rachel's maid, 12 sons of different mothers. However, one day, because Israel knew only too well of his eldest son's penchant for causing trouble abroad, he sent Joseph, his second youngest son, on a mission to check on the whereabouts and the activities of his older siblings. When his older brothers saw young Joseph coming toward them, and having already developed an intense dislike of him, in part because their father Israel favored him the most of all his sons, they conspired with one another to do Joseph some type of harm. So when he came amongst them, his brothers threw Joseph down a well, where several wanted to leave him, while still others, with a change of heart, voted to pull him out. However, at that precise moment, a caravan heading for the land of Egypt arrived at the well, and after negotiating a deal, his brothers retrieved Joseph from the well, and they delivered him to the traders, who in turn took Joseph along with them to the land of Egypt, where Joseph was eventually sold. In the meantime, Joseph's older brothers deceived Israel, making him believe Joseph had been attacked and killed by a wild beast, a story which caused Israel a great deal of anguish and a lasting sadness. However, as Joseph grew into adulthood, he proved himself to be a valuable asset to the Pharaoh who ruled over the land of Egypt. And Joseph rose in prominence and stature until he was managing all of the Pharaoh's business affairs. And when he rightfully predicted the coming of a 7-year famine, it resulted in the stockpiling of food crops, which he later apportioned back to the Egyptians, much to the profit of the Pharaoh. A number of years later, when a blight occurred in the land of Canaan, Israel instructed his 10 eldest sons to travel down to the land of Egypt to purchase fresh, untainted seed. On their arrival in Egypt, the brothers approached Joseph, who had long been in charge of all such business matters. But even though the brothers didn't recognize the now mature Joseph, who had become completely immersed in the culture of Egypt, in appearance, language, and manner, Joseph recognized them. After toying with his brothers' emotions over several weeks' time, by framing them, accusing them of stealing, having them arrested, and holding them for ransom, Joseph eventually revealed to them who he was and forgave them for their past misdeeds, since it was because of their actions that he was now wealthy and held in such high esteem by the Pharaoh. And it was just for this reason, because of his highly placed position and his talent for conducting profitable business affairs, that the Pharaoh, after hearing the entire story of how Joseph had first come to Egypt and the sadness it had caused to both he and his father, that the Pharaoh invited Israel and all of his offspring, along with their entire families, to come and live in the land of Egypt. When Israel heard that Joseph was alive and thriving in the land of Egypt, Israel left Hebron, and together with all the members of his family, 68 in number, traveled down to the land of Egypt, where Israel and the Israelites settled in the district of Goshen, where they would prosper under Joseph's protection. However, in time, Israel died. And with the permission of the Pharaoh and with a promise to return, Joseph escorted Israel's body back to Hebron, where he placed him in the family cemetery just as his father had requested. When Joseph returned to Egypt, he continued to oversee all of the Pharaoh's business ventures, from which the Israelites prospered as well. But when both Joseph and the Pharaoh who had held him in such high esteem died, the new Pharaoh became increasingly wary of the Israelites because their population had grown substantially, from the original 68 members to a population of more than 1,000 people, within only 3 generations since their arrival in the land of Egypt. And because they had now become an intimidating presence, the new Pharaoh issued the order to kill all newborn Israeli males to put a stop to any future threats. At the same time, the new Pharaoh also required the people of Israel to perform manual labor to the benefit of the people of Egypt. And to further assure that they fully complied with this order, he placed a near impossible quota on the number of unreinforced bricks the Israelites were required to produce, even though it was well known that bricks of this type were very fragile in nature and broke more easily than those that were reinforced with straw. Into this environment and under these conditions, the baby Moses was born into the tribe of Levi. And because he was a newborn Israeli male, and fearing for his life, his family placed him in the river and set him adrift. Floating downstream toward the land of Egypt, Moses was rescued by an Egyptian woman, who then fostered him as her own. But as Moses matured, he became increasingly aware of his cultural heritage and was angered by the oppression the Israelites were experiencing. Then one day Moses killed a native Egyptian, whom he had seen mistreating an Israelite, and now fearing for his own life, Moses fled to Midian, where he met and married Zipporah, a Cushite woman, the daughter of Raguel, with whom Moses eventually lived and for whom he eventually worked. As Moses was tending to Raguel's flocks at the base of Mount Sinai, he was sure he had just felt something quite unusual. In taking off his sandals, Moses stood barefoot on the ground as he felt the earth beginning to tremble beneath his feet. Moses quickly climbed to the top of the landmark mountain, the Horeb, and when he looked from that lofty summit, he beheld a fiery sight. A red-tinged plume in the form of a bush was rising up on the horizon, and recognizing the perils and widespread devastation that an impending volcanic explosion could cause to the nearby Israelites, Moses immediately set out for the land of Egypt to demand that the Pharaoh let his people go. But the Pharaoh had no inclination to believe Moses had any influence over what was taking place, but instead attributed the volcanic activity to natural causes. But even so, the effects the volcano was having on the land of Egypt intensified with each passing day. The water of the Nile, whose flow was now seriously impaired, became contaminated with red boiling mud, causing an epidemic of gargantuan frogs to flee from the steaming ash-filled water, until the carnivorous mammoths overran the city of Egypt. But then an infestation of maggots and flies suddenly appeared in great numbers as they fed on the piles of their rotting carcasses, while the district of Goshen was spared. Soon thereafter, the livestock began to die an anguished death after ingesting the fine ash, which now covered everything. and caused boils to appear on every Egyptian skin. While yet again the district of Goshen was spared. Soon thereafter, chunks of burning pumice began to fall from out of the sky, while a pyroclastic flow, a surge of intensely hot air, swept down along the side of the volcano with such a tremendous force that nearly every single crop, orchard, and tree was leveled to the ground, while the district of Goshen was spared yet again. Then locusts spawned and rose up out of the dampened soil as drenching rains, caused by the superheating of the atmosphere, began to fall with a greater intensity and freed them from their larvae, until the swarms of these voracious insects devoured all else that remained of any crops before a shifting wind suddenly swept them all out into the Red Sea. But then came the darkness, and for 3 days the poisonous fumes lingered and enveloped the land of Egypt. And the firstborn members of every Egyptian family, those who were the eldest, and who were the most vulnerable and frail, began to suffocate and die, while Goshen was spared. Only now did the Pharaoh, overwhelmed by the mounting devastation the volcanic explosion had inflicted on his land and on his people, finally, yet with great personal reluctance, grant to Moses his request to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, since unlike the Pharaoh himself, many of the Egyptians believed Moses was responsible for all these misfortunes. Moses, along with his brother Aaron, immediately returned to Goshen, and as the Israelites made their hasty preparations to depart from the land of Egypt, the Philistines, who themselves had moved southward to escape the devastating effects of the erupting volcano, and who had also heard the news of the Israelites' impending departure, saw the bustling activity suddenly taking place across the river in the district of Goshen, and formed a defensive line along the banks of the river to prevent the Israelites from passing through their already stressed territory, since this was the shortest route to Midian. And even though the superstorm had intensified, Moses, with no other choice, set a course that would lead him around the land of Egypt, and then directly into the Red Sea. With more than 1,000 Israelites, half of which were children, he moved ever closer towards the superheated, moisture-rich atmosphere. As electricity ripped horizontally across a black and boiling sky, and as the volcano spewed its poison, and peals of thunder beyond imagination shook the ground, the drenching rain quickly began to fill the numerous channels in the Red Sea uplands, causing numberless streams to merge at countless junctions throughout this entire broad desert area, until the unprecedented quantities of water came together to form one single swiftly flowing stream, which rumbled down out of the Red Sea highlands and spilled out onto the desert plain. And as the bewildered Israelites arrived at this edge of the Red Sea, they found the path of their exodus completely blocked by the wide swath of roaring water that rushed past them on its way to the boiling river. At that very same moment, the Pharaoh, overwhelmed at his mounting misfortunes and his personal losses, became enraged when he learned that the Israelites had breached their agreement by taking some of Egypt's wealth with them when they had departed from the land of Goshen. And so when his spies further informed him that the Israelites were trapped at the southern edge of the Red Sea, with no possibility of crossing over to the other side, he set out after them. Charging across the ash-covered plain, the Pharaoh and his army raced into the Red Sea, drawing ever closer to the trapped Israelites who, amid flashes of brilliant light, could see the line of Egyptians rushing toward them under the deafening skies. Drenched, bewildered, stranded, and with a terrible foreboding of death only minutes away, the multitude was filled with the most unimaginable human fear of both men and now of all natural things. Almost all knelt down in the ash, raking it over their heads as they wailed with incredible despair and grief. Nothing could have prepared them for this moment and these conditions. When all of a sudden, a great shift in the wind occurred. It was a mighty force that gripped the storm and began to drag it away, and at the same time caused a thick volcanic smoke to sweep down, to form an impenetrable barrier between the Israelites and the Pharaoh's forces, who were instantly stopped by the unexpected phenomenon. And as the storm over the Red Sea swung away, the flooded channels of the uplands suddenly began to drain and to go dry. But just as suddenly as the forceful wind had appeared, so too did it shift back again, and the barrier of smoke began to clear, while in the same instant the numberless streams throughout the broad area of the Red Sea uplands once again began to fill and to merge. But Moses saw his opportunity, and raising his rod into the air, he shouted maniacally. And just as the water of the Red Sea parted, they ran. 1,000 and more Israelites of every age, drenched, ash-covered, and wild-eyed, they coaxed, stumbled, dragged, and carried one another through the bottom of the Red Sea on dry ground. But the Pharaoh's forces were in full pursuit, and they charged forward. However, the gritty volcanic ash had seriously compromised the wooden axles of their racing chariots, whose hubs seized up until the wheels, burning and broken, came off in splinters. But still they carried on. And under great duress, the whiplashed horses dragged the slowed and wheelless vehicles into the midst of the streambed, where the Pharaoh and his entire hindered entourage was suddenly swallowed by the renewed water surging out of the Red Sea uplands, and they drowned. Soon after the drowning, a great calm came over the land as the volcanic activity quickly subsided and stopped. But before moving on, the Israelites returned to collect the possessions they had so hastily abandoned, and to scavenge the bodies of the Pharaoh and his forces, taking for themselves all of their weapons. But the after effects of the volcano were widespread, and to get clear of these dangers, Moses had no other choice but to lead the Israelites even further out into the Red Sea desert, where they journeyed for weeks and quickly became destitute for water. However, in time, having finally cleared the dangers of the ash field, Moses turned slightly westward and set a course back towards the river. In the meantime, with the Israelites gone and the volcanic activity now subsided, the Philistine army began withdrawing their defensive forces in the south. But as the Israelites drew nearer to the river, they were confronted by the gold-rich Amalekites, who were determined not to let the large multitude of Israelites pass through their territory. But the Israelites, using the weapons they had scavenged from the Pharaoh's drowned army, were able to win the ensuing skirmish before resuming their journey northward along the river, and directly toward the overland trail where highly prized water wells, of very limited yields, had been dug at great human expense all along its entire course. But the people of Cash, more powerful in numbers and more skillful with weapons than the Amalekites, immediately blocked all points of access to the overland route, forcing Moses and the Israelites to turn southward to Mount Sinai, where upon their arrival they found themselves surrounded and boxed in by both the Philistine and Cashite forces, who had been shadowing their every move. Moses and the Israelites reached Mount Sinai 90 days after leaving Goshen. But shortly after their arrival, Moses found himself constantly contending with the endless domestic disputes which erupted among the vociferous Israelites, whom he found to be both unruly and uncooperative. As a result, he retreated to the top of Mount Sinai and ultimately, based upon the most common disputes he had contended with, he delivered the laws which the Israelites were to abide by if Moses had any hope of ever moving the squabbling tribes forward to the Promised Land. And he delivered these laws on two separate occasions, since he had smashed the first set of tablets in a fit of rage, when upon his initial return from atop the mount, he found the Israelites performing serious acts of insolence. However, in time, Moses did deliver the laws, which are more popularly known today as the Ten Commandments. And to further develop a sense of solidarity and unity among the conflicted tribes, he devised yet another means to put their pent-up energies to a greater use, by bringing the tribes together in a common cause, to build and furnish a tabernacle, whose ruins are still there today. And as part of this comprehensive plan to maintain their newfound sense of solidarity once they were again underway, Moses devised yet another plan. And so he commissioned the creation of a special container into which the tablets of the Ten Commandments would be placed. This portable container would always be carried in the open for everyone to see, and would serve as a visual reminder of their collective pledge to maintain their newfound solidarity once their quest to reach the Promised Land had resumed. And so this special container, of unique design, the symbol of their collective pledge, became known as the Ark of the Covenant. After Moses had negotiated a structured departure from Mount Sinai, the Israelites set out in stages to eliminate any perceived risks to the neighboring territory. And before the annual floodwaters arrived, they crossed to the opposite side of the Gihon at the earliest cataract, where castellated stones provided a tenuous footbridge and a tethered ferry crossing. As they marched northward, the Israelites struggled against hunger, illness, and epidemic deaths, and at times even thirst. However, they eventually arrived at the milestone point of Ararat, where they encamped for a long while as a respite before once again resuming their northward march. But when they arrived at the junction of two separate trails, Moses sent out 12 spies with the instruction to determine which was the better route to follow. When the spies returned, 10 of the 12 reported that neither route was possible. The northwestern route was primarily through a desert, but even though it followed along an aquifer, every oasis along its course was heavily guarded and also situated at the bottom of a long ridge, making any group of Israelis, either large or small, vulnerable to attack and decimation. While the northern and most direct route would lead them directly into the midst of the Amalekite colonists, whose southernmost kinsmen they had already defeated. And beyond the Amalekites were the Philistine colonists of Egyptian heritage, and beyond them were the various tribes descended from the Ishmaelites, who knew only too well of how Abraham had abandoned their patriarch Ishmael in the desert of Paran to deny Ishmael, and by extension even themselves, their birthright. Remembrances that fostered both anger and a deep mistrust of the Israelites. But even despite the reports that each territory was staunchly guarded by a large populace bearing a great deal of animosity for the people of Israel, a small contingent of Israelis, believing their insurgency would be successful, set out along the northern route. But no sooner had they done so than the northern alliances, just as Moses had predicted, swept down on them, forcing the Israelites to turn back in a hasty retreat towards Kadesh. In dire need of an alternative route, Moses then crossed to the other side of the river in search of one. And being the very first to arrive on the opposite shore, and anxious to see what lay ahead, Moses set out all by himself in a chariot, while the support forces were still in the midst of coming across the river and were still busy mustering on the shore. Moses, who was now all alone, continued to move further away from the mustering Israelites, when suddenly he was ambushed by hundreds of men who had been hiding in the nearby hills, and who now rushed down onto the plain of the Orontes River watershed, surrounding him from every direction. From the south came the Kashites, and from the north came the vengeful Edomites, who, fueled by the remembrance how Esau, their ancestral patriarch, had been swindled by his younger twin brother Israel, were now adamant, bound and determined not to let their distant cousins, the people of Israel, enter into the territory of Edom. With the combined armies closing in on him, Moses turned his chariot, and charging across the open plain, he crashed his devoted team of horses through the swarming ranks, and raced back to the Israelis who were still mustering on the shore. With the Amalekites, the Philistines, and the Ishmaelites, the Kashites, and the Edomite armies massing all around the Israelis' position, Moses had no choice but to order a hasty retreat southward and to flee back towards the Red Sea. But the path of the full retreat was sealed off, and the Israelites found themselves completely boxed in. And so the Israelites would remain isolated in this wilderness where they would wander, and would eventually return to Mount Hor, where for the next 35 years Moses would govern and conduct all diplomatic matters. But with each passing year, the youthful population of the Israelis continued to expand and was fast becoming a viable threat, causing the officials of Amarna in the land of Edom to send out letters of appeal to their northern allies, requesting that they send aid so the foreigners, the Habaru, or Hebrews, could be kept in isolation right where they were. However, after 35 years, in accordance with the Treaty of Kadesh, the aged Moses was finally granted a compromise solution to his incessant and repeated requests to move the ever-expanding Israeli population northward toward the Promised Land without further altercations. The Edomites of Ammon granted him permission to do so, but only if he led the Israelites around the land of Edom and not through it. So after 35 years of wandering in this isolated zone, the aged Moses, leaving all of their building enterprises behind, led the masses of the new generation of Israelites up the plain of the Orontes River watershed that ran all along the base of Mount Sinai on the east side of Edom. And as they approached the northern extremes of this particular leg of their journey, the people then began referring to the Israelites as the people from Egypt, or otherwise simply as the Egyptians. As the large masses of Israelites came around the land of Edom and emptied out onto the plains of Moab, their arrival there was intercepted by the Philistine and allied forces who had formed a formidable defensive line on the opposite side of the floodplain, forcing Moses and the Israelites to turn their energies northward. But here too the Israelites were met with a great resistance and were denied permission to pass through the land of Moab. But the Israelites, with its large population of young men from the new generations, quickly attacked these lesser skilled tribes. Launching a brutal invasion on the people of Moab and Ammon and all areas to the north, they slaughtered all living things without mercy. And as the relentless slaughter moved forward, thousands of refugees fled from the adjoining regions of Syria and Philistia, and they streamed into the more northern regions to escape the genocide. At the conclusion of the invasion, Moses was now nearing his own natural death. And as his last official act, he gave the newly decimated lands of Moab and Ammon to the Israelite tribes of Reuben and Gad, and to half of the people belonging to the tribe of Joseph's son, Manasseh. But Moses, one of only 3 left from the original group who had departed from the land of Egypt 40 years earlier, and after having traveled more than 2,000 miles under the most extreme conditions, would never set foot in the Promised Land, but would only get to look across and see it for the last time from atop of Pisgah Peak, just before he died. After his death, the body of Moses was secretly transported back to Mount Hor, where he was interred in the same royal tomb fields where his brother Aaron, his sister Miriam, and his wife Zipporah had been placed many years before his own death. After the mourning period for Moses had ended, the people of Israel, under Joshua's command, and with the Ark of the Covenant, the tangible symbol of their collective pledge, being carried at the head of the column by the tribe from which Moses was descended, crossed over the Jordan. And 40 years after leaving the land of Egypt, the Israelites finally entered the Promised Land. And for many years thereafter, the people of Israel conducted numerous raids throughout the adjacent areas, attacking the Canaanite, Syrian, and Philistine people, who, despite their many letters appealing to the coalition forces based in Ammon to send assistance to help them in repelling the Habarus, they too, just as their counterparts had done before them, fled to points further north to escape the onslaughts, while the more powerful southern alliances, who had elected not to diminish their own resources by sending aid, instead combined them into a single force to establish their own defensive lines to prevent any intrusive actions by the marauding Israelis. But before his death, the aged Joshua, who was now the only survivor of the original group to have left the land of Egypt at the very outset of the Exodus, sent surveyors out to thoroughly map the land and its natural features. Thereafter dividing the entire region into specific areas, districts, and territories, which each tribe to the west of the Jordan River was to make their own by means of their own individual tribal conquests, since the people of Israel had not yet completely overtaken the areas contained within this broad region. But before dividing the large tract of Canaanite land into sections of equal quality amongst the 9.5 tribes who now lived on the west side of the Jordan River, Joshua first combined it with the large parcel which Israel had bequeathed to its 4 sons Judah, to whom Israel had left all his wealth. Having bypassed his oldest son Reuben because he once had intercourse with one of Israel's concubines, and Israel had bypassed his next 2 second oldest sons, Simeon and Levi, because they repulsed Israel with their unabated love for extreme violence, weapons, and injustice, having murdered men and maimed animals just for fun. So it was Judah who inherited his father's wealth and thereafter his patriarchal authority, thus the moniker Jew. Years after Joshua's death, and long after the people of Israel had resigned themselves to a reasonably peaceful coexistence, a man by the name of Samuel came to power, but not as a king, but rather as a prophet. However, the people of Israel became dissatisfied with his temperament and his ability to manage their affairs. So Samuel, much to his chagrin, designated Saul a most unlikely candidate to be the very first king to rule over the people of Israel. But Saul, much to everyone's surprise, proved to be a much better commander than Samuel had ever expected. So in his continuing quest to discredit Saul, and in the hopes of being reinstated in his former role as the man in charge, Samuel chided Saul into attacking the powerful and skillful Amalekites, under the pretense of punishing them for not allowing Moses to pass through their land so many years before. Ultimately, Saul did attack, but he didn't fail as Samuel had hoped, but instead Saul succeeded in destroying the Amalekite nation by driving his forces all the way forward down to Mount Hor, where a stela depicting the first documented name of Israel still exists, which commemorates how the people of Israel triumphed over the people who lived in the land of Canaan. This concise, real-world story is a depiction of the actions, the events, and the route of the Exodus, including how and where the water of the Red Sea parted. Today, the Exodus route taken by the people of Israel still exhibits the physical and historical elements of that era, and they are as indelible as they are precise in accordance with the Judaic record. However, in retrospect, it was not much more than 100 years ago that the founder of Zionism, in his quest to create a haven for people of Jewish origins, offered these sentiments to his few followers. The historic homeland of the Jews no longer has any value for them. It is childish to go in search of the geographic location of the homeland. In any case, I believe that after the next Congress we shall proceed in a practical way to the land, any land. These words were spoken by Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern political Zionism, because the geographical whereabouts of their cultural past were a complete unknown then, just as they still remain today. It is imperative to realize that Theodor Herzl's idea to establish a religiously based haven for the people of the Jewish faith was firmly rejected by the larger majority of those who are also of Jewish heritage, since his ideology stood in stark contrast to the prophecies contained within their own scriptures. The larger majority of the Jewish community contended that by ignoring the scriptures, Herzl was merely promoting his own ideas under false pretenses, with no consideration for the ramifications his actions would cause. It is a contention and a controversy which still exists within the vast realm of the Jewish community to this day, and is yet another footnote to history as to how so few can affect so many. The term Zionism comes from the name given to a very specific mountainous area where the city of David, and subsequently the Temple Monument of Solomon, a single massive structure built of huge stones by hundreds of thousands of men who toiled continuously for several decades, was erected in the land promised to Shem, a son of Noah, their maritime ancestor, and a survivor of the Great World Flood. It was also the site where a second structure of similar characteristics would also be built, but whose lesser height King Herod would later increase by adding a stone cap to its already towering pinnacle. This was Zion. It is based on a term that means to mark something conspicuously, but is now embraced by the larger Jewish community as meaning the world to come. Today, despite nearly a century of aggressive attempts to do so, no proven, untainted, or infallible evidence yet exists which confirms the declarations made by those untrained men in the 19th century as to the location of either the Exodus route, Mount Sinai, Mount Zion, or any other critical point of interest to be either true, accurate, or precise in accordance with the Judaic record. And in the absence of tangible evidence, only theories and untruths remain. And when untruths are spoken often enough, the unsuspecting eventually believe them to be true. When the chaos finally ends, Jerusalem and the monument will become the world's greatest attraction. International disputes will be settled, and all nations will convert their weapons of war into implements of peace. Then at last, all wars will stop, and all military training will end. For your sons and daughters are coming home to you from distant lands. For I have reserved the ships of many lands, the very best, to bring the sons of Israel home again from far away. Violence will disappear, and all war will stop. And they shall rebuild the ancient ruins and repair the cities long ago destroyed, reviving them though they have lain there for many generations. But Daniel, keep this prophecy a secret, seal it up, for these things will not be understood until the end times, when the knowledge of travel and education has been vastly increased.